This is a fictional story inspired by real life. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a cold and cloudy Wednesday in Chicago, the kind of afternoon where the low clouds seem to press down on the skyscrapers and the biting wind from Lake Michigan forces people to walk a little faster along the downtown streets. In this gray and chilly setting, a 73-year-old gentleman slowly pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the Heritage National Bank, the largest and most imposing private financial institution in the historic heart of the city. The building stood on one of the most prestigious corners of Michigan Avenue, clad entirely in white marble with towering columns that made any ordinary person feel small just by standing on the sidewalk and looking up toward the ornate cornices. The gentleman's name was Arthur Sterling. Arthur was 73 years old, with hair as white as the marble outside, combed back with the quiet care of a man who still respected himself, but possessed no trace of vanity. He wore dark gray trousers that were slightly faded at the knees, a flannel checkered shirt buttoned to the very top, and over it, a chestnut-colored wool coat that had clearly seen much better days. On his feet was a pair of black leather shoes, worn at the soles but polished to a dull shine. In his right hand, he carried a dark wooden cane with a rubber tip, and in his left, he held a manila paper folder with great care. It was one of those old-fashioned folders with a faded elastic band holding everything together, its edges frayed as if it had spent years in a drawer before someone finally decided to bring it back into the light of day. Arthur entered the bank and paused for a second just past the revolving doors, as if he were orienting himself to the environment. And the environment was, admittedly, enough to impress anyone. The floor was white marble with golden veins. The ceilings were dizzyingly high with crystal chandeliers that poured a warm, amber light over everything, and the waiting area chairs were upholstered in the finest pale beige leather. At the far end, behind a long counter of polished black granite, stood the tellers, all dressed in navy blue suits and silver ties with name tags pinned to their chests, sporting that trained smile that only appeared when the approaching customer looked like they were worth the effort. At tables along the side walls, well-dressed consultants attended to clients who arrived in tailored suits with elegant leather briefcases tucked under their arms, and the posture of people who knew exactly how much money was in their accounts and felt no need to prove it to anyone. It was into this world of wealth and precision that Arthur Sterling stepped with his cane, his worn folder, and his old coat. Immediately, without him having said a single word yet, things began to happen. A security guard near the entrance raised his eyebrows slightly. A client in a $1,000 suit glanced sideways with that look of someone who thought a person had entered the wrong building. Two tellers behind the counter exchanged a quick glance, that silent communication that requires no words to say a great deal. The natural hum of the bank, the murmur of quiet conversations, and the clicking of computer keys seemed to dip for a heartbeat, as if the entire room had sensed something out of place. But Arthur did not look intimidated in the slightest. He took a deep breath, adjusted the folder under his arm, firmed his grip on his cane, and began to walk slowly toward the service counter. Each step he took echoed lightly on the marble floor, the tip of his cane making a dry click with every movement. Even with everyone watching, even with that heavy silence forming around him, Arthur walked with a quiet dignity, the kind one only finds in people who have been through much worse in life and have learned that the opinions of strangers do not pay the bills. Behind the counter, the teller facing him was named Madison. Madison had her hair pulled back into a perfect tight bun, wore deep burgundy lipstick, and had impeccably manicured nails that matched her flawless uniform. She was competent, organized, and had excellent internal reviews. She possessed a smile she could turn on and off as the situation demanded. When she saw Arthur approaching, she did not turn off the smile, but its quality changed. It took on a different shine, one that wasn't exactly hostility, but certainly wasn't a welcome It was the smile of someone who had already decided what the person approaching wanted before hearing a single word they had to say. Arthur reached the counter, leaned his forearms lightly on the granite edge, and spoke with a calm, clear, and polite voice, without any hesitation. He said, "Excuse me, miss. I am having a problem with my account. It has not been functioning correctly for a few days." Having said this, he placed the manila folder on the counter and pushed it toward Madison. Madison looked at the folder, then at Arthur, then back at the folder. She did not open it. She did not type anything into her computer. She did not ask for his social security number or his debit card. She did not do anything a bank teller is supposed to do when a client reports an issue. Instead, she tilted her head slightly to the side like someone being very patient with a difficult child, and said in that overly careful tone that is, in practice, a way to humiliate without raising one's voice. She said, "Sir, it seems to me that you might have walked into the wrong bank. Heritage National serves a very specific profile of clients. If you like, I can point you toward a smaller branch or a public credit union nearby that might be more suitable for what you need." Arthur heard everything without changing his expression. He let her finish, waited a second, and then said with the same calm as before, "Miss, please, just check the system once. Perhaps my account is indeed here in this bank. The number is right there inside the folder if you wish to verify it." Madison sighed internally. That sigh one doesn't let out, but that is felt nonetheless. She picked up the folder, opened it, and gave the documents a quick glance. It was the look of someone who isn't actually reading, just pretending to verify. She closed it again almost immediately and said, "Sir, this is going to require some time to be analyzed properly. You will have to wait in the seating area. Please, go sit over there." And, without even giving Arthur time to respond, Madison turned to her side and began typing something on her computer as if the matter were closed. Arthur's folder, containing his documents, was left lying on the counter to the side without the slightest care. Arthur looked at it for a second, then looked toward the waiting area she had indicated. It was a small corner at the very back, with 2 leather chairs pushed against the wall near the printer and a water cooler, far away from the comfortable, plush chairs where the suit-wearing clients waited with gourmet coffee in their hands. But Arthur said nothing. He picked up his folder, turned, and walked over there with his cane, sitting down with the patience that had already become his trademark. The bank continued to function around him. Consultants saw clients, phones rang, and printers whirred. And there in the corner, in a leather chair by the water cooler, sat a 73-year-old man with a worn folder in his lap, waiting. Everyone who passed by looked at him. Some whispered something to a colleague. Some smiled out of the corner of their mouths. And others simply averted their eyes quickly, the way people do when they don't want to get involved, but also won't do anything to help. Time passed. 15 minutes, then 30. Arthur remained seated. He didn't take a phone out of his pocket, he didn't flip through any papers, and he showed no sign of restlessness. He simply sat there with both hands resting on the handle of his cane, looking slightly into the space before him with an expression that was hard to decipher, but which seemed to hold many hidden things. After about 40 minutes of sitting there, Arthur stood up slowly, adjusted his wool coat, gripped his cane firmly, and walked back to the counter. Madison was still there. Arthur said with the same politeness as before, "Miss, I am sorry to bother you, but I have been waiting for a long time. If you are very busy, I would like to speak with the branch manager. There is a matter that needs to be handled directly with him." Madison looked at him with that forced patience, typed something, picked up the intercom, and called. The manager's office was at the back, separated from the main hall by a glass wall with semi-open blinds. One could see the silhouette of the man inside sitting behind a large desk. The manager's name was Richard Lawson. Richard was 42 years old, tall and wore a navy blue suit with a perfect cut, a very expensive watch on his wrist, and a heavy graduation ring on his right hand. He had entered the bank as a trainee 20 years ago, had risen slowly through the ranks, and had been in this management position for several years. He was respected by his superiors and feared by his subordinates, which is the kind of combination that makes many people think they are good managers when they are actually just authoritarian with those who cannot fight back and sycophants with those who can. Richard heard Madison over the intercom saying there was a gentleman who wanted to speak with him. Richard glanced through the semi-open blinds, saw Arthur at the counter, and made a judgment in less than 3 seconds. He spoke quietly into the intercom back to her. "What kind of client is this, Madison? Does he have a premium account here?" Madison hesitated and said she didn't know for sure. Richard gave a heavy sigh and said, "I don't have time for this kind of situation right now. Tell him to wait in the seating area. If he stays there long enough, he'll eventually leave on his own." And that was exactly what happened. Madison conveyed the message with that thin veneer of kindness, saying the manager would see him as soon as possible, and Arthur returned to the chair in the corner. Another 20 minutes passed. It was at this moment that a third person entered the scene. A younger employee, who was returning from a break with a cup of coffee in his hand, crossed the hall and stopped when he saw the old man sitting alone in the corner while a nearby colleague whispered something with an ironic smile on his face. This employee's name was Michael. Michael was 26 years old and had been working at the bank for 2 years in a junior position, handling documentation and registration processing. It wasn't a position that appeared in important meetings or on the organizational chart when the bank made presentations to investors. It was the kind of job that exists everywhere but that no one notices much. Michael stopped, looked at the gentleman, heard what his colleague was whispering, which was basically a joke about what a man who looked like that could be doing in a bank like this, and Michael did not laugh. He became serious, placed his coffee on a nearby table, and walked over to where Arthur was sitting. He approached, bowed slightly to be at the level of the seated man, and said in a natural and respectful voice, "Good afternoon, sir. Are you being helped? Is there anything I can do for you?" Arthur looked at Michael with focus, spending a second evaluating the young man. Then he said, "Young man, I need to speak with the manager of this branch. There is a matter that cannot be resolved just at the counter." Michael nodded and said, "Of course, sir. Let me see what I can do. I'll be right back." Michael went to Richard's office, knocked on the door, and entered. Richard was on the phone and made that hand gesture that tells the other person to wait. When he hung up, he looked at Michael with the face of someone who had no time. Michael said, "Mr. Lawson, the gentleman who has been waiting for almost an hour in the seating area, insists on speaking with you. It seems like an important matter." Richard placed his pen on the desk slowly and said, "Michael, I already know that. I was the one who told him to wait there. Go busy yourself with your work. This is not your problem, and you are not to get involved in this." Michael swallowed hard, nodded, and left. He went back to his desk, but continued to look occasionally at the corner where Arthur was sitting. More time passed. And then Arthur stood up again. This time, he didn't go to the counter. He went straight toward the manager's office. He walked through the hall with his cane clicking on the marble, passing between the consultants' desks, heading for the glass door of Richard's office. When Richard saw him coming, he stood up from his chair, opened the door before Arthur reached it, and stood in the doorway with his arms lightly crossed in a posture that mixed impatience with that false professionalism of someone who doesn't want to look rude in front of others, but also isn't going to let the other person into the room. Richard said, "Sir, what is it that you need? You can tell me right here." Arthur stopped in front of him, handed him the folder, and said with the same calm voice as always, "Look, in this folder are the details of my account. I have not been able to make any transactions for a few days. I would like you to check the system and tell me what is happening." Richard took the folder, glanced at it without really opening it properly, without going to his computer, without doing anything technical at all. Then, he let out a short laugh. One of those laughs that a person tries to pass off as professional, but is actually pure arrogance. He said, "Look, sir, when an account sits idle for a long time or has an insufficient balance, the system blocks operations automatically. I imagine that is the case here. You must have had a zero balance for some time, and that is why the transactions were blocked. It is the standard procedure of the bank." Arthur looked at him with great calmness and asked, "But did you check the system?" Richard replied without hesitation, "Sir, I have years of experience in this sector. Just by looking at the situation, I can already diagnose the problem. I don't need the system for that. Now, with all due respect, I ask that you leave. You are drawing unnecessary attention inside the branch, and other clients are noticing. If you like, Madison can show you where a branch more suited to your profile is located." Arthur heard everything. He did not change his expression, did not raise his voice, and did not get nervous. He simply reached out his hand, took the folder back from Richard's hands, placed it on a side table nearby, and said, "Very well, I will go. But I am leaving this here for when you have a little time. It is worth taking a look." And then Arthur turned, walked slowly toward the exit with his cane, and just as he was reaching the revolving door, he stopped. He turned his body from where he stood, looked at Richard, who was still standing at the entrance of his office, and said in a voice that wasn't loud or aggressive, but was absolutely firm, "Keep one thing in your memory. What you did today will have a consequence. A very serious consequence." Having said this, Arthur Sterling walked through the revolving doors and disappeared out into the cold afternoon of Michigan Avenue. Richard stood still for a second. Those words hit differently. It wasn't the angry tone of someone venting frustration. It was the tone of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next. But then Richard shook his head slightly, pushed that thought away, went back into his office and closed the door. The old man was just talking in the heat of the moment, he told himself. Everyone does that. There was nothing behind it. The folder with Arthur's documents was left on the table outside, next to the counter, where Richard had left it. No one went to pick it up. No one went to verify anything. The bank continued to function normally, with clients in suits entering and leaving, and the folder remained there, forgotten. It was Michael who picked it up later when the movement had slowed down. He saw the folder on the table, picked it up, opened it, and took the documents out. There was a paper with a social security number, an account number, and a copy of a very old bank statement. Michael went to the computer at his station, entered the bank's internal system, and began to type the data, first the social security number, then the account number, and then the screen loaded. Michael sat perfectly still, staring at the monitor for about 5 seconds without doing anything. Then he blinked, read it again, scrolled down the screen, read more, scrolled again, and then leaned back slowly in his chair like someone who needs a moment to process what they have just seen. Arthur Sterling's account did not have a zero balance. Arthur Sterling's account had a balance that most people would never see, even if they added up the salaries of an entire lifetime. But that wasn't even the most impactful part. What was there on the screen, in the registration information of the account, in the shareholding records linked to the profile, was information that completely changed everything that had happened that afternoon. Arthur Sterling was the majority shareholder of Heritage National Bank. 62% of the bank's shares were registered in his name. He wasn't an important client. He wasn't a heavy investor. He was the owner. He was one of the original founders, the man who had signed the opening documents of that institution decades ago, who had built that white marble building with money that took years to gather, who had established the internal rules, hired the first people, and created the first financial products. Heritage National Bank existed because Arthur Sterling wanted it to exist. Michael sat staring at the screen for a long time. Then he printed a full report, folded it, tucked it under his arm, and went to Richard's office. Richard was with an important client at that moment, a middle-aged businessman who had just arrived, and the two were talking excitedly about a new investment product the bank was launching. Richard had that manager's smile in enchantment mode, the smile that appeared automatically when there was enough money and prestige on the other side. When Michael entered, Richard looked up and made a discreet hand gesture that meant, "What is it? But make it fast, because I don't have time." Michael went to the desk, placed the printed report on it, and said softly, "Mr. Lawson, this is the report for the account of the gentleman you saw earlier. I think you need to see this right now." Richard looked at the paper without picking it up, looked at Michael, and said in the same low tone, "Michael, I already told you I am not going to waste time with that. Go back to your station." Michael said, "Mr. Lawson, with all due respect, it is very important. Please, just take a look. Just once." Richard picked up the report, gave it a cursory glance without changing his expression, and pushed it back toward Michael, saying, "I have no interest in zero-balance accounts. If you show me this again, you are going to have a serious problem." Michael took the paper back, nodded, and left the office. He went back to his station, folded the report, put it in his drawer, and sat with that uncomfortable feeling of someone who knows something vital but doesn't know what else to do with the information. That night, while Chicago grew colder outside and the lights of the city turned on one by one, Michael kept thinking about the gentleman in the old coat who had arrived with a worn folder and left without being heard. And he also thought about the words the man had said on the way out, that there would be a consequence, a very serious consequence. The next morning, it was exactly 11 o'clock in the morning when the revolving doors of Heritage National Bank opened again. Arthur Sterling walked in. This time, however, he was not alone. At his side was a man in his 50s, tall in an impeccable charcoal gray suit, a burgundy tie with a gold pin in the knot, and polished shoes that reflected the glow of the marble floor. In his hand, he carried a black leather briefcase with gold latches, the kind of thing that appears when someone has important documents and wants others to know it. This was Arthur's lawyer, one of the senior partners of one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms specializing in corporate law and governance. The two entered together and stopped in the middle of the hall. They didn't go to the counter. They didn't go to the seating area. Arthur simply stood there, looking toward Richard's office with that calmness that was already his trademark, and made a slight nod of his head toward the glass. Madison saw them enter. Other tellers saw them too. Madison's smile wavered for a fraction of a second. There was something different in Arthur's posture now, or perhaps it was the presence of the lawyer with the black briefcase, or maybe it was simply that calmness he carried, which suddenly seemed dangerous in a way that the previous day had not made clear. Richard also saw them through the semi-open blinds of his office, and this time, unlike the day before, he stood up from his chair and came to the door without needing to be called. He left his office, crossed the hall, and stopped about 2 meters away from Arthur and the lawyer, with the posture of someone who is still trying to look in control but already feels that something is wrong. Richard said, "Good morning. How can I help you?" Arthur looked at him for a second, then said in a firm voice, but completely without anger, without drama, without theatrics, "Mr. Lawson, I told you yesterday that there would be a consequence. Well, the time has come." Richard swallowed hard, opened his mouth to say something, but Arthur continued, "You treated me yesterday in the most disrespectful and unethical manner I have witnessed in decades of involvement with the banking system. You did not verify my account. You did not comply with any of the basic service protocols. You made me wait for almost an hour and a half in conditions you offered to no other client. You made judgments about my financial situation based exclusively on the clothes I wore, and you asked me to leave the bank as if I were an inconvenient presence. And Madison, who was the first teller to receive me, did exactly the same thing, saying I was probably in the wrong bank without even checking my registration in the system." Richard was visibly sweating now. He said, "Sir, I apologize if there was any misunderstanding. I did not know who you were." If I had known, I would have Arthur interrupted him with the same calm as before. That is exactly the problem. The service in this bank should not depend on who I am. The protocol is the same for any client who arrives here, regardless of how they are dressed or how much money they appear to have. This is not my opinion. It is the policy of this institution, written in document, approved in board meetings, and the obligation of every employee. A policy that you violated in a clear and documentable way. The lawyer opened his briefcase, took out an envelope, and handed it to Richard. Richard opened it with slightly trembling hands. It was a formal letter on the law firm's letterhead, with the Heritage National Bank header stamped below, describing the situation of the previous day in precise detail, with times, names, and a description of the conduct of Richard and Madison. And at the end, it informed that by decision of the controlling shareholder with 62% of the bank's shares, Mr. Richard Lawson was being removed from the position of branch manager, effective immediately. He would be offered a transfer to field duties, specifically in the area of collections and visits to defaulting clients, should he wish to remain with the company. Otherwise, termination would be processed according to labor laws. Richard stood staring at the paper. He was silent for a time that seemed very long. Around them, the bank had stopped. Not literally, but practically. The tellers had slowed down, the consultants had turned their eyes slightly toward that side, and the clients being served had also realized that something important was happening in the middle of the hall and were looking discreetly. Richard finally said, "Sir, who exactly are you?" Arthur replied, "You can consider me the owner of this bank, because, technically, that is what I am." And at that moment, as if confirming everything, the lawyer took another sheet from the briefcase. It was the shareholding registration document. Arthur Sterling's name, 62%, the date of the institution's founding, it was all there. Richard looked at the sheet without saying anything. Arthur then called Michael, who was at the back of the hall. Michael came with quick steps, not knowing exactly what to expect. Arthur said, "Young man, you were the only employee in this branch who yesterday took the trouble to come to me, greet me, ask if I needed help, and then still tried to make your boss see that report. That says everything about your professional character and your sense of responsibility to the client." The lawyer took one more document from the briefcase. A formal promotion letter signed by Arthur himself as the controlling shareholder, promoting Michael to the position of branch manager, effective immediately, with all the corresponding salary and contract adjustments. Michael stared at the letter with the expression of someone who couldn't process what was happening. His eyes watered slightly, but he didn't let a tear fall. He nodded and said, "Thank you very much, sir," with a firm but emotional voice. Arthur then called Madison. She came to him with a pale face. Arthur said with absolute clarity but without cruelty, "Madison, you are receiving a formal warning recorded in your file. This warning will stay, but you remain in your position with a second chance, because I believe you have the capacity to understand what you did wrong and correct it. What can never happen again, under any circumstances, is a client being judged by the clothes they wear or the appearance they have before any professional verification. If you had simply typed the Social Security number into the system yesterday, none of this would have happened. You would have seen what you needed to see and acted differently, and I would not have needed to go through all of this." Madison lowered her head and said in a low voice, "You are right, sir. I am sorry. I have nothing to add." Arthur nodded, was silent for a second, then turned to everyone who was there, clients and employees together in a hall that was completely quiet now, and said in a voice that did not need to be loud to be heard in every corner of all that marble, "You all have a lot to learn from Michael. Not because Michael is going to be your boss now, but because he did something very simple yesterday that no one else here did. He treated a human being with respect before knowing how much that human being was worth to the bank. That is not kindness. That is basic professionalism. And it is the only kind of professionalism that matters in here. Arthur paused and continued, "From now on, the bank's management will send auditors disguised as ordinary clients periodically. People in simple clothes, with no appearance of money, who will come in here, ask for service, and hand a report directly to me on how they were treated. Any repetition of what happened yesterday will have much more serious consequences than today's." Having said that, Arthur Sterling took his cane, adjusted his chestnut wool coat, and walked toward the revolving doors with the lawyer by his side. Before reaching them, he stopped one last time, turned his body slightly, and said, without looking at anyone in specific, "Take good care of this house. It took me many years to build it." And he went through the doors and vanished out there on Michigan Avenue with his old coat, his wooden cane, and his manila folder under his arm. The bank remained in silence for a few seconds after he left. Then someone breathed, someone coughed, and someone began to type on a computer again, slowly. The bank returned to its functioning, but it was a different kind of functioning, more cautious, more conscious, with people who now knew that appearance says nothing about who the person on the other side of the counter really is. Richard left the branch that same day with a box of belongings and a transfer in his hand that he still needed to decide whether to accept. The colleagues who remained did not celebrate, did not make jokes, and did not say anything. There was a collective discomfort of people who recognized themselves in a story where they would not have chosen to be supporting characters. Michael sat in the manager's office for the first time that afternoon. The office that had been Richard's, the large desk, the high-backed chair, the view through the blinds to the hall where the employees worked. He stared through that glass for a while, thinking about the gentleman in the old coat and worn folder who had arrived the day before and whom no one wanted to hear. And he thought that sometimes the most important thing we do in life isn't the complicated thing or the heroic thing. It's just going to the chair in the corner where someone is being ignored and asking how you can help. The story of what happened at Heritage National Bank that day and the next spread quickly through Chicago's business circles. Not through the newspapers, not through social media, but in that way important stories spread from person to person, in business lunches, in elevator conversations, in late-night messages, between business partners. And invariably, when someone told it, the other person would say, "That is what separates a real founder from a shareholder who only shows up to collect dividends. One puts in the money, the other puts in the soul." And Arthur Sterling, who had put his soul into that bank decades earlier, went home that afternoon, hung his chestnut wool coat on the hanger by the entrance, leaned his cane against the wall, and warmed up a small bowl of vegetable soup on the stove. Because in the end, owning 62% of a bank doesn't change what you eat for dinner. It only changes what you are capable of doing when someone thinks they can diminish you just because your coat is old. This experience reminds us all that true wealth is never found in the balance of a ledger or the fabric of a suit, but in the quiet dignity of one's character and the simple act of seeing the humanity in others. As we navigate a world that often demands we prove our worth through outward symbols, we must remember that the most valuable assets we possess are our integrity and the respect we offer to those around us, regardless of their status. Life has a way of revealing the truth in its own time, and those who choose to lead with an open heart and a fair mind will find that their legacy is built on a foundation far more enduring than marble or gold. It is in the moments when we think no one is watching that our true nature is most clearly defined. And it is those quiet choices, the choice to be kind, to be thorough, and to be humble that ultimately shape the world we leave behind for others. Respect is a currency that never loses its value. And when we spend it freely on every person we encounter, We enrich ourselves and our communities in ways that money could never achieve. Let us walk through the world like Arthur, with our heads held high and our hearts grounded, knowing that our worth is intrinsic and that the greatest power we have is the power to lift others up simply by acknowledging their presence and their value as fellow travelers on this long and often difficult journey we call life.